In 2012, the European Union actually won the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, the committee praised it for over 6 decades of contributing to peace and reconciliation.
Right. The whole project at its core was designed to make war on the continent materially impossible.
Right.
Just by intertwining everyone's economies.
Exactly. Fast forward to February 2026, though, and that exact same institution has just published an official document outlining the blueprints for an 800 billion euro military-industrial complex.
But the contrast is genuinely striking when you put it like that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a complete inversion of the European identity here.
Yeah, it really is.
For decades, the implicit deal was that Europe would focus on economic prosperity, soft power, standardizing consumer regulations, and they'd basically outsource the hard power.
The actual security umbrella.
Right, mostly to the United States through NATO. But the document we're analyzing today, which is titled Protect What Matters, it signals that the era of outsourced stability is officially over.
Yeah, right in the opening pages, it bluntly states that in today's fractured and uncertain world, Europe can no longer rely on others for its defense. And, well, that is what we are digging into today.
It's a huge shift.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We have our hands on the EU's massive Readiness 2030 plan, and our mission is to unpack how a union famous for, regulating charging ports and privacy laws is attempting one of the hardest pivots in modern geopolitics.
Racing to build a formidable, self-sufficient war machine from the ground up.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to make a pivot this massive, you can't just change your philosophy, you have to open your wallet.
You definitely do.
Yeah.
And we're dissecting the sheer mechanics of this proposed transformation.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing for politicians to issue a press release declaring strategic independence, right?
For sure.
But it is another thing entirely to reorganize the industrial base, the logistics, and the financial laws of 27 sovereign nations to actually make it happen.
And the sheer scale of the financial mobilization Europe is attempting here is just hard to conceptualize. They aren't just adjusting the budget, they are basically ripping up the floorboards to find the cash.
They are. The Readiness 2030 plan is aiming to facilitate up to 800 billion euros in investment over just a 4-year window.
Wow.
And you're right about ripping up the floorboards, because generating that kind of capital requires breaking some of the most sacred economic rules the European Union has ever established.
I want to focus on exactly how they're doing that, because this isn't just about raising taxes. I mean, imagine you live in a perfectly safe, predictable neighborhood. You leave your doors unlocked.
Right.
But then, almost overnight, you realize the local police station 3 towns over has essentially closed down. And suddenly the neighborhood watch just isn't going to cut it.
Right. You need something real.
Exactly. So what do? Everyone on the street decides to buy their own advanced security systems, reinforce the fences, hire private security. But to afford it, you have to drain the local PTA fund, empty out the budget meant for filling potholes, and max out every single line of credit the neighborhood association has.
That is a very accurate analogy.
So how is the EU legally doing the equivalent of that?
What's fascinating here is the specific mechanism they are using to bypass their own financial laws. The document relies heavily on something called the National Escape Clause under the Stability and Growth Pact.
Which sounds like an action movie title, but I'm guessing it's deeply bureaucratic. What exactly is the Stability and Growth Pact, and why do they need an escape clause?
Well, the Stability and Growth Pact is essentially the fiscal straitjacket that keeps the euro currency stable. It legally requires member states to keep their budget deficits under 3% of their GDP.
Okay.
And it keeps their overall debt under strict control. It's really the ultimate rulebook of European fiscal conservatism. If a country overspends, the EU normally penalizes them.
But not anymore.
Right. The document reveals that 16 member states have activated this national escape clause. By doing so, they are legally pausing those strict deficit rules to leverage up to 650 billion euros for defense.
Wait, 650 billion? They're hitting the emergency override button on the entire European economy.
Basically, yeah.
They're essentially saying, we cannot care about our debt-to-GDP ratio if there's a risk of the continent being attacked.
That is exactly the calculation. They determine that military readiness supersedes fiscal discipline, and they're pulling other equally drastic levers, too.
Like what?
Well, they've authorized a new SAFE instrument, which is 150 billion euros in loans, helping 19 member states scale up immediately through joint procurement. They're even changing the mandate of the European Investment Bank.
The EIB, don't they usually fund, peacetime stuff?
Exactly. Historically, that bank exists to fund public transport infrastructure or green energy projects. But now, They're redirecting billions of its lending capacity directly into defense and security projects, specifically $3.5 billion in 2025 and $4.5 billion in 2026.
Oh, wow. I even saw a note in the document about redirecting cohesion policy funds. And if I understand correctly, cohesion funds are the money the EU uses to build bridges in poorer regions so their economies can catch up to the richer ones, right?
That has been their primary purpose for decades, yes. Upgrading infrastructure, supporting local businesses in disadvantaged areas.
And now that's going to defense.
Yeah. Giving member states the green light to redirect those specific funds toward defense shows you just how total this reprioritization really is.
But having a giant pile of cash, even 800 billion euros of it, is really only step one. I mean, you can't just throw pallets of euros at a border and expect it to shoot down incoming missiles.
No, you definitely cannot.
You have to physically build the equipment, which leads us to the actual machinery of this plan. How is Europe going to build this stuff?
Well, building it is actually the central crisis the document is trying to solve. The EU has realized their defense industry is deeply fragmented, so they're deploying a variety of funds to stimulate domestic manufacturing capacity. For example, the European Defence Fund, or EDF, has mobilized 6.4 billion euros since 2021 for tomorrow's tech, and they have an act in support of ammunition production with a 500 million euro injection specifically for domestic capacity.
Because the war in Ukraine proved that high-tech jets are basically useless if you run out of standard 155mm artillery shells in the second week of a conflict.
Precisely. The goal is to ensure a constant, reliable supply chain that isn't dependent on factories in other parts of the world. They also have the European Defense Industry Program, which is 1.5 billion euros from 2025 to 2027, just for responsiveness and supply.
That's a lot of separate funds.
It is. They're also proposing a massive five-fold increase in the next long-term EU budget, dedicating 131 billion euros to a European Competitiveness Fund for defense and space. And they want to fund 4 major European readiness flagships.
Okay, I read about these and I really have to push back here because the 4 flagships are a drone defense initiative, an Eastern Flank Watch, a European air shield, and a European space shield.
Right.
On paper, it sounds incredibly futuristic and robust. But let's look at reality. We are talking about 27 different sovereign countries. Historically, France wants to buy French fighter jets. Germany buys German tanks. Sweden buys Swedish technology.
That's very true.
They have completely different procurement rules and domestic defense industries that actively compete with one another. So how on earth do you force them to suddenly build a seamlessly integrated air shield?
The fragmentation you're describing is widely considered the Achilles heel of European defense. You hit the nail on the head. National protectionism has always prevented a unified military structure.
Right.
But the architects of this document know that. And they're not trying to change human nature. They are using economics to bypass the politics.
How so?
Through aggressive financial incentives for common procurement. The document outlines specific grant mechanisms like a 310 million euro grant designed to essentially bribe member states into playing nice.
Bribe them. How does that work in practice?
Well, the mechanism works like this. If France, Germany, and Poland decide to independently buy 3 different types of air defense systems, they pay full price.
Okay.
But if they agree to form a consortium and buy the exact same system together, the EU will grant them that 310 million euros to subsidize the purchase.
Ah, so they are artificially lowering the barrier to entry if you agree to standardize.
Exactly. They're using market forces to drive military integration. If you do this over a few years, suddenly multiple countries are operating the exact same interceptors, using the same radar software, and sharing the same supply chains for spare parts.
So an integrated European air shield is no longer this political pipe dream.
Right. It becomes a natural byproduct of economic efficiency.
You buy together to save a buck, and you accidentally build an interoperable continental defense system in the process. That is a brilliantly sneaky bureaucratic workaround.
It really is.
But the urgency driving this, the reason they are suddenly so desperate to standardize and build these shields, isn't theoretical. It's happening right on their doorstep.
Yes. The war in Ukraine is the undisputed engine behind the Readiness 2030 plan. The document details that 69.3 billion euros have already been provided in military assistance.
That's through the European Peace Facility and individual states, right?
Exactly. Plus, they've trained over 85,000 Ukrainian soldiers. But the strategy has evolved far beyond just sending aid packages.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you read the section on the new 60 billion euro Ukraine support loan, the language shifts dramatically. It isn't just about handing over surplus weapons from old European stockpiles anymore.
No, not at all.
It specifically mandates that the funds support Ukraine's own defense industrial capacities and military equipment. They even establish an EU Defense Innovation Office physically located in Kyiv. Why put the office in an active war zone?
Because the EU has recognized that Ukraine is no longer just a recipient of aid.
Yeah.
It is the most advanced, high-intensity military research and development environment on the planet.
Oh,
By establishing a physical presence there, and by actively integrating the Ukrainian defense industry into the European one, the EU is cementing a symbiotic R&D partnership.
it's an iteration cycle you simply can't simulate in peacetime. I mean, if a European tech company develops a new drone jamming frequency and it gets tested in a peacetime lab, it might take 2 years of regulatory review before it sees the field.
Right, the bureaucracy slows it down.
But in Ukraine, a drone gets jammed by a new electronic warfare tactic on Tuesday. The software is rewritten on Wednesday, and the patched drone is back in the air on Thursday.
That rapid prototyping is exactly what Europe wants to internalize. By integrating the Ukrainian industry directly into their supply chain, they ensure that the harsh, daily lessons of modern warfare are baked immediately into the Readiness 2030 initiatives.
So Ukraine gets a capital and the deeper manufacturing base, while Europe gets unparalleled real-time battlefield data.
Exactly. It forces the European defense sector to modernize at a wartime pace.
Which brings us to a massive theme in the latter half of the document, and that is future-proofing. Because while they're desperately trying to learn from the current conflict, they also realize they cannot fight tomorrow's wars with yesterday's logistics or yesterday's corporations.
Yeah, we are seeing a distinct shift away from relying solely on the giant legacy defense contractors. The plan outlines a defense industry transformation roadmap that focuses heavily on startups and small to medium enterprises.
They mentioned something called the EU Defense Innovation Scheme, or Readiness, and this really jumped out at me. They are explicitly trying to lower the barriers to entry for commercial tech startups focusing on AI, swarm drones, and space technologies.
It's a huge pivot.
It feels like they're trying to inject Silicon Valley startup culture into a notoriously slow military procurement process.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a harsh vulnerability in modern defense. The prime contractors, the companies that have been building warships and tanks for 70 years, are fundamentally slow.
Right.
Their bureaucratic overhead is immense. A commercial tech startup, however, might be able to develop a revolutionary AI targeting algorithm or a new satellite communication protocol in 6 months.
So UDIS is the bridge for that.
Yes. It's designed to provide those agile startups with the funding and the pathways they need to get their innovations past the prototype phase and actually onto the battlefield without being crushed by government paperwork.
I love the focus on the agile little guys. But honestly, the single most eye-opening part of this entire 2026 document isn't the AI algorithms or the space shields or the drone swarms, it's the roads.
Ah, yes. The Military Mobility Initiative.
They are scaling up the budget for military mobility by a factor of 10, a 10 times increase, reaching 17.65 billion euros for the 2028 to 2034 period.
It's a massive investment in infrastructure.
And to explain why this matters, I mean, imagine you're tasked with building the ultimate Amazon Prime delivery network. But instead of cardboard boxes, you have to move 60-ton main battle tanks, hundreds of thousands of troops, and endless pallets of high-explosive ammunition across an entire continent rapidly.
Right.
You can have the smartest startups in the world. You can have a seamlessly integrated air shield. But none of it matters if a civilian bridge collapses the moment a tank drives onto it.
Exactly. Logistics is the unglamorous backbone of deterrence. The reality is that Europe's civilian infrastructure was not built to sustain the rapid mass movement of heavy armor.
Just everyday roads and bridges.
Right. The Military Mobility Roadmap essentially views the physical landscape, the strength of the asphalt, the height of railway tunnels, the load-bearing capacity of bridges as a critical vulnerability.
And it isn't just the physical bridges, right? It's the bureaucratic borders. I was reading how, historically, moving a military convoy from France through Germany to Poland requires a mountain of diplomatic clearances.
Absolutely.
You can have a train full of howitzers stuck at a border crossing for 4 days just because someone didn't stamp a customs form correctly.
That administrative friction is exactly what they're trying to eliminate. The 17.65 billion euros is meant to dual use the infrastructure, upgrading it for civilian trade, but ensuring it meets military load specifications.
Right, killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Exactly. And simultaneously harmonizing those cross-border legalities. They need to ensure that their newly standardized hardware can actually travel from the Atlantic coast to the eastern flank at a moment's notice.
Because speed is deterrence.
Yes. If an adversary knows you have a massive army, but they also know it will take you 3 weeks to move it across a river, your deterrence is effectively zero.
It is the vascular system of the entire Readiness 2030 plan. If the blood can't pump quickly to the extremities, all that expensive muscle simply doesn't matter.
A very apt analogy. The mobility network is what binds the individual national forces into a credible, continent-wide capability.
All right, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today on this Readiness 2030 blueprint. Let's take a step back and summarize the journey of this deep dive.
It's been quite a ride.
It really has. We started with the sheer financial shockwave, an 800 billion euro awakening, utilizing unprecedented tools like the National Escape Clause to pause strict fiscal laws and fund a massive military pivot.
We then explored how they are tackling industrial fragmentation, using hundreds of millions in financial subsidies to essentially bribe member states into joint procurement.
Paving the way for those standardized air and space shields.
Exactly.
From there, we looked at the deep integration with Ukraine, noting the shift from simply providing aid to treating Kyiv as a real-time R&D partner and a core extension of the European industrial base.
And finally, we unpacked the logistics, the startup innovation schemes under Readiness, and that massive 10x boost to military mobility.
The 17.65 billion euro push to reinforce the bridges, roads, and railways that hold this entire vision together.
It is, without question, a comprehensive and incredibly ambitious blueprint. Whether a political entity of 27 distinct nations can execute it seamlessly by 2030 is going to be the defining challenge of the decade.
Definitely.
But the sheer intent and the financial mechanisms they have already triggered are just undeniable.
And why should you, our listener, care about this dense policy document? Because you are actively witnessing a once-in-a-generation rewiring of the global order.
You really have a front row seat.
You do. The European Union was designed to make internal war impossible through economic trade. Now it's reshaping itself to make external aggression unwinnable through overwhelming industrial defense. Understanding the mechanisms of this document is a shortcut to understanding where global geopolitics is heading over the next 10 years.
The ripple effects of a unified, militarized Europe will alter every trade agreement, every international market, and the calculus of every future conflict.
So what does this all mean? We started this conversation by imagining a neighborhood that realizes its local police station has closed.
The residents suddenly have to break their piggy banks, pool their money, build their own fences, and basically learn to protect themselves.
Right. But I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to ponder on your own.
It's the geopolitical elephant in the room.
Exactly. If Europe actually pulls this off, by 2030, they successfully transform from a continent historically reliant on others for its security into a fully integrated, self-sufficient 800 billion euro military powerhouse, how will that fundamentally alter their relationship and balance of power with their historic protector, the United States, in the decades to follow?
That is the ultimate question.
When the neighborhood no longer needs the police station to keep them safe, the entire power dynamic of the city changes. Something to think about.